You are standing in the middle of nowhere, truly nowhere. It is a bright, dry morning in the year 1956, and all around you, in every direction you turn, there is nothing but the high, open savanna of central Brazil, the Cerrado. They call it a rolling country of red dust and twisted low trees and coarse pale grass, stretching flat and empty to a huge, indifferent sky. There is no city here. There is no town. There is no road worth the name. The nearest coast, where almost every single one of your countrymen lives, is 1,000 kilometers behind you, over the hills and far away. The wind moves the grass, and a hawk turns slowly overhead, and the silence is the silence of a place where nothing much has happened since the world began. And yet, look down at your feet. Someone has been here before you, driven into that red earth in a long straight line running off toward the horizon. There are wooden stakes, survey markers, little flags of cloth snapping in the wind, and a man in a dusty suit is unrolling a drawing on the hood of a truck, a drawing covered in curves and axes and blocks, and he is telling you with a straight face, with total seriousness, that right here, on this exact patch of empty dust where you cannot see a single building or a single human being for miles, there is going to be a capital city. Not in 100 years, not in 50. He points at the calendar. In under 4 years, a whole city, government and cathedral and boulevards and all, conjured out of this red nothing before the decade is out. And you look at the emptiness and you look at the stakes and you think the man is mad. He was not mad. Hold that empty horizon in your mind, the dust, the stakes, the impossible promise, because they did it. They actually did it. And the story of how, and the far stranger story of what it cost, and what it could not change no matter how new they built it, is one of the most astonishing and most quietly heartbreaking things I have ever had the pleasure of teaching. Come in, and pull that chair a little closer, because this one I love to tell. My name is Joaquim. For the better part of 40 years, I stood at the front of a classroom in Brazil and did my level best to make the history of this enormous, improbable country come alive for children who mostly wanted to be somewhere else. And if I am honest with you, there were a handful of stories I saved for the days when I needed to win them back. The days when the eyes were glazing over and I could feel the room drifting to the window. And this was one of my very best, because this is not a story of a war or a massacre or a slow injustice grinding on for a century. This is a story about a dream, a gigantic, audacious, slightly ridiculous dream, a country that decided, in the middle of the 20th century, to pick up its own capital and carry it 1,000 kilometers into the empty heart of the continent, and to build the whole thing, from the first stake in the dust to the ribbon cut on Inauguration Day, in the time it takes some people to finish renovating a kitchen. But I have to warn you, my friend, because you know me by now, or you soon will. I do not tell the pretty half of a story and stop there. The building of Brasilia is a genuine wonder, and I want you to feel the wonder of it fully because it is deserved. But hidden inside that wonder is a lesson so sharp and so honest about what human beings can and cannot do, that once you see it, you will never look at a shiny new plan for a perfect future quite the same way again. So let us build a city together. Let us start, as they had to, with the emptiness, and with a dream far older than the man who finally dared to make it real. Here is the first thing that surprises people, and it surprised my students every time. The idea of moving Brazil's capital into the interior was not some sudden brainstorm of the 1950s. It was old. It was ancient by the standards of a young country. It had been a dream and an argument for well over a century before a single stake was driven into that cerrado. Think about the shape of Brazil for a moment. From the very beginning, from the first Portuguese ships, the whole life of the country clung to the coast, like a man clinging to the rim of a vast dark bowl, afraid to let go and slide down into the enormous, unknown interior. The cities, the wealth, the ports, the people all pressed up against the Atlantic, all facing outward toward Europe and the sea, with their backs turned to the immense inland that made up almost the entire body of the nation. And clever people looked at that again and again and said, "This is not healthy. A country cannot live its whole life on its own doorstep. We must plant our capital in the center, in the heart, and pull the nation inward, and finally turn around and face our own land." The man usually given the credit for saying it first, and saying it most clearly, was one of the great founding minds of independent Brazil, a statesman and scientist named José Bonifacio de Andrada. Back in 1823, in the very cradle of the independent country, he argued for a new capital in the interior, and here is the detail I love: he is the one usually credited with proposing the name. The name Brasilia. More than a century before it existed, before there was a single brick to give it to, the city already had its name, waiting. And the dream did not die with him. It kept surfacing, generation after generation, the way a really stubborn idea will. When Brazil became a republic, and the men of the new republic sat down in 1891 to write their constitution, they wrote the dream right into it. They marked out, in the founding law of the nation, that a zone on the Central Plateau would be set aside for a future federal capital. It was there on paper as a promise, as an instruction to some future generation. And then, as promises on paper so often do, it sat there, for decade after decade. Everyone agreed it was a fine idea. Nobody did it, because it was, let us be honest, completely insane. Who picks up a capital and moves it into a wilderness? It was the kind of glorious dream a nation keeps in a drawer, and takes out now and then to admire, and puts carefully back, because actually doing it is impossible. Until, one day, a man came along who did not believe in the word impossible. His name was Juscelino Kubitschek de Oliveira, and everyone then and now simply calls him J.K. He was a doctor by training, a physician from the state of Minas Gerais, and he became president of Brazil in 1956, and he was, by every account I have ever read, one of the most relentlessly, incurably optimistic human beings ever to hold the office. Where other men saw problems, J.K. saw a building site. He came into power with a development plan and a slogan attached to it, and the slogan tells you everything you need to know about the man. He promised the country, and say it slowly with me because it is a wonderful piece of political nerve, 50 years of progress in 5. 50 years in 5. He was going to hurl Brazil half a century into the future in a single presidential term. Roads, power plants, steel, cars, industry, the whole modern world all at once, all now. And the crown jewel of it, the boldest and most impossible and most personal piece of the whole mad program, was the one dream everyone had agreed for 130 years was too hard to attempt. He was going to build the capital. He was going to take that promise out of the Constitution, out of the drawer, and drag it, kicking and screaming, into the real world of concrete and dust. And he was going to do it inside his own term of office, so that no one who came after him could quietly cancel it. That was the crucial, cunning part. J.K. understood something about grand national dreams, that if you leave them as dreams, they stay dreams forever. The only way to make a capital in the wilderness real was to make it real so fast and so far along that it could never be undone. Speed was not just ambition. Speed was the whole strategy. He had to finish it, or as good as finish it, before he left office. And that is why the clock in this story matters so much. That is why everyone remembers the number, because he did not have 50 years. He barely had 4. So where do you put it? They surveyed the central plateau, the high tableland in the state of Goiás, deep in the interior, and they chose a site on that empty cerrado, the savanna, where our story began roughly 1,000 kilometers from Rio de Janeiro, which was the capital at the time, the glamorous seaside capital of beaches and music that everyone actually wanted to live in. And I want you to really sit with the physical reality of that choice, because it is easy to say they built it in the interior and miss how brutal the logistics were. There was, essentially, nothing there. No city to build out from, no proper roads to bring materials in on, no railway. Every bag of cement, every steel beam, every pane of glass, every worker, every sack of rice to feed the workers had to be hauled across 1,000 kilometers of rough country, or flown in by air, to a spot in the wilderness where a city was supposed to appear. The red dust of the cerrado got into everything. In the dry season it hung in the air, and in the wet season the whole raw site turned to a sea of red mud. There were no comforts. There was no shade. There was, at the start, quite literally nothing but the horizon and the stakes and the drawing on the hood of the truck. And onto that emptiness, J.K. proposed to summon, in under 4 years, one of the most ambitious pieces of city building anyone had ever attempted. It was less like construction and more like a spell. But a spell needs a shape. If you are going to conjure a whole city out of nothing, you cannot just start piling up bricks. You need a plan. And not just any plan, because here is the thing that makes Brasilia unlike almost every other great city on earth. Most cities grow. They start as a village at a river crossing or a good harbor, and they sprawl and tangle and thicken over centuries, street laid over street, an accident piled on an accident, until you get the beautiful, glorious mess of a London or a Rome or a Rio. Brasilia was not going to grow. Brasilia was going to be designed, all at once, on paper, by one mind, a complete, finished, perfect city thought up in advance and then simply built. They held a competition for the master plan, and it was won by an urban planner named Lucio Costa, and his winning entry he called it the Plano Piloto. The pilot plan is one of the most famous drawings in the history of cities. Costa's idea was startlingly simple, almost childlike in its clarity. He drew 2 great axes crossing each other, a long straight one and a long curved one bending across it like a drawn bow. A cross. 2 lines crossing on the empty plateau, and people looked at that cross, and their imaginations went to work, because it looked like something. Depending on who you ask, and Costa himself gave more than one answer over the years, that shape has always been read as an airplane, wings spread, ready for takeoff, which felt perfect for a country hurtling into its modern future, or as a great bird or a dragonfly coming to rest on the plateau, or, in a more solemn reading, simply as the sign of the cross, blessing and claiming the empty land, the way the very first Portuguese had planted a cross on the beach 4.5 centuries before. An airplane, a bird, a cross. Take your pick. But the point is that the whole city was organized around that shape. Down the long straight spine, the monumental axis, went the great buildings of state, the ministries and the seat of government, marching in a grand ceremonial line. And along the sweeping curved wings, the residential axis, went the housing, laid out in tidy, repeating blocks that Costa called superquadras superblocks, each one meant to be a self-contained neighborhood with its own shops and school and greenery. All equal, all rational, all planned. It was, on paper, a utopia. And I do not use that word loosely. Costa and the people around him genuinely believed they were not just drawing a city. They were drawing a better way for human beings to live. A clean, ordered, modern, egalitarian city, free of the slums and the chaos and the cramped misery of the old coastal cities. A fresh start on fresh ground where the future itself could be built correctly, from scratch, this time getting it right. Hold on to that word, egalitarian, equal, because it is going to come back and break your heart. Now a plan is bones. To give a city a face, you need an architect, and for that J.K. turned to a man who would become, quite simply, the most famous architect Brazil has ever produced, and one of the most famous in the entire world, Oscar Niemeyer. If Lucio Costa gave Brasilia its skeleton, Oscar Niemeyer gave it its soul and its face, and its unforgettable strangeness. Niemeyer was a poet in concrete. He looked at that gray, heavy, industrial material reinforced concrete, the stuff of car parks and bunkers, and he made it do things that seemed to defy gravity and common sense. He hated the straight line. He said, in one of his famous remarks, that he was drawn instead to the free-flowing curve of the mountains, of a river, of the human body. And he poured those curves into the buildings of Brasilia until the whole city looked like nothing anyone had ever seen. Let me walk you past a few of them, because words barely do it, but I will try. There is the Palacio da Alvorada, the presidential residence, the Palace of the Dawn, and along its face runs a row of columns so slender and so gracefully curved, meeting the ground at delicate points, that the whole great building looks as though it is resting on tiptoe, as light as a dancer. There is the National Congress, the heart of Brazilian democracy, and Niemeyer set it out as a piece of pure sculpture. Two tall, slim, identical towers rising straight up, and beside them, low on the great platform, two vast shallow domes, one turned up to the sky like a bowl, holding one house of the legislature, and one turned down like a dome, covering the other. A bowl and a dome and two towers. You have seen it, even if you did not know its name. It is the very symbol of Brazil. And there is the cathedral, perhaps my favorite of all, which from the outside is a ring of great white concrete ribs, curving up and inward, and then flaring open at the top like hands raised in prayer, or the petals of a crown, with the whole roof between them made of glass, so that when you walk inside and you enter, wonderfully from below, coming up a dim tunnel into the light, you find yourself in a soaring, luminous space flooded with sky. And there is the Palacio do Planalto, the working seat of the presidency, all horizontal calm and those signature curved columns again. And it was not only buildings. The land between and around them, the gardens and parks, were shaped by another giant, the landscape artist Roberto Burle Marx, whose flowing, painterly gardens of Brazilian plants were as modern and as sculptural as the concrete they framed. Costa, Niemeyer, Burle Marx, a plan, a face, a setting, the finest talents the country had, all pointed at the same impossible spot in the dust, all told the same impossible thing: go fast. It has to be finished before the president leaves office. And so we come, at last, to the people who actually built it, because Costa did not lay a single brick. Niemeyer did not pour a single column. Those beautiful curves were dreamed in an office. They were raised in the red dust by hundreds of thousands of hands. They called them the Candangos. It is a wonderful, complicated word, Candango. It seems to have started as a slightly mocking name, and it turned into a badge of fierce pride, the way the best names sometimes do. The Candangos were the workers, the builders, the men, and it was mostly men, though the women came too, to cook and to keep the boomtown alive, who did the actual, physical, back-breaking labor of raising a city out of nothing at the speed of a miracle. And here is the part that matters most, the part I most want you to carry with you. Where did they come from? They came, in enormous numbers, from the northeast, from the cerrado, the dry, hard, drought-stricken backlands of the northeastern interior, the poorest region of the country, a land of cracked earth and failed harvests and hunger, from which the poor had been fleeing in search of work for generations. When word went out that there was work in the interior, endless work, urgent work, a whole city that needed building yesterday, they came. They crossed the country on the beds of open trucks, in journeys of days and days across the rough new roads, poor men chasing the rumor of a wage. And they arrived to find a raw, chaotic, roaring frontier. They built around the clock. This is not a figure of speech. To make JK's impossible deadline, the construction ran in shifts, day and night, the worksite lit by floodlights against the huge black cerrado sky, so that from a distance the empty plateau glowed like a fire in the darkness, 24 hours a day, month after month after month. Men poured concrete at 2 in the morning. The city rose in a fever, and the Candangos who raised it lived, in those years, in a rough and ready boom town that sprang up beside the great construction site, a sprawl of wooden shacks and mud streets and bars and stores and hope and hardship, which everyone called, with real affection, the Ciudad Libre, the Free City. Later it would get the more official name of Núcleo Bandeirante, but in the building years it was the Free City, and it was where the real, sweating, human life of the project actually happened, not in the clean superquadras of the drawing, in the mud. Now, I am a history teacher and not an accountant, and I will tell you honestly that the precise price tag of Brasilia is argued over to this day, and anyone who gives you one confident number is rounding off a mountain. But the shape of the cost is not in doubt. Building a whole capital city, at emergency speed in a wilderness 1,000 kilometers from the nearest supplies, is monstrously expensive. To do it in under 4 years, JK's government spent and borrowed and printed money on a colossal scale. The crash construction of Brasilia poured fuel on the nation's debt, and it helped drive inflation upward, that slow, cruel tax that eats the wages of the poor first. The bill for the miracle did not come due on Inauguration Day. It came due for years afterward, quietly, in the cost of bread and the value of a wage, paid disproportionately by the same kind of poor Brazilians whose hands had built the place. Keep that in your mind, too, as we walk toward the end. The wonder had a receipt, and it was not the wonder's admirers who mostly paid it. And yet, and this is the astonishing thing, the thing that makes the whole story worth telling, they made the deadline. On the 21st of April, 1960, only about 41 months after the serious work began, Brasilia was inaugurated as the capital of Brazil. Roughly 3.5 years from red emptiness to a functioning seat of national government. The president stood in his city of white curves rising out of the plateau, the city that 130 years of Brazilians had said was impossible, and it was real. The dream was out of the drawer. The impossible thing was simply, undeniably there. And I want to give that its due, fully and without irony, before I turn the story over. It is one of the great feats of nerve and will of the 20th century. A poor and unequal country, mocked by richer nations, looked at its own empty heart and decided to plant a modern capital in it, faster than anyone believed possible, and it did it. The Candangos, who came from the dry northeast with nothing built, with their own hands, a city that the whole world would come to photograph. That is real, that pride is earned. Nobody can ever take the achievement away. But now I have to turn the story over and show you its other face, because I promised you I would not stop at the pretty half. And the other face of Brasilia is the reason I have kept you here. Here is the question. You have a clean slate. You have the emptiest patch of ground imaginable. No old city, no old slums, no old injustice built into the streets. You have the finest planners in the land, and a plan they honestly believe is egalitarian, equal, a fresh start where everyone lives in the same tidy, dignified super blocks. You are quite literally building the future from scratch, with the past left 1,000 kilometers behind you on the coast. So tell me, when it is finished, is it equal? Did you escape? Did the clean slate stay clean? It did not. And the way it failed is the whole lesson. Think about who was there. The city was designed for a certain kind of resident, the civil servants, the ministers, the functionaries who would move inland from Rio to run the government, housed in those planned, comfortable superquadras of the Plano Piloto. But the people who actually built the city, the hundreds of thousands of Candangos, the poor migrants from the cerrado, the plan had not really made a place for them to stay. They were labor. They were supposed to build the future and then, in a sense, step out of the picture. But of course they did not vanish. They were human beings, with families, who had crossed a continent and given their sweat to this ground, and they wanted to live in the city they had raised. And they were, for the most part, kept out of the center. The planned, beautiful, egalitarian Plano Piloto, the airplane, the bird filled up with the better off, and the workers who built it were pushed outward, to the edges, into settlements that were never in Lucio Costa's elegant drawing at all. Satellite towns, they came to be called places like Taguatinga that grew up on the periphery, unplanned or barely planned, to hold the poor who had no place in the plan. And so, my friends, look at what happened. Look at it clearly. They flew 1,000 kilometers from the old, unequal, rich center and poor reg cities of the coast, precisely in order to escape all that, to build something clean and fair on empty ground. And what did they build? A rich center and a poor edge. The gleaming, monumental, well-served heart, and around it, out of sight of the postcards, the ring of poorer satellite towns where the builders lived. The exact geography of old Brazil, the wealthy core. The humble periphery reappeared, faithfully, in the one place on earth that had been designed from nothing specifically to be free of it. And I am not just giving you my own reading here, my own teacher's sad little moral. This is the central argument of one of the most important books ever written about the city, and I want to name it, because you deserve to be able to go and read it yourself. An American anthropologist named James Halston went and studied Brasilia deeply, and he wrote a book with a title that says the whole thing in 4 words, The Modernist City. Its subtitle is an anthropological critique of Brasilia, and what Halston showed, patiently and powerfully, is exactly this paradox, that the modernists dream the clean plan, the perfect blocks, the rational city that would produce a more equal society just by being built correctly collided with real human life, and in crucial ways produced the opposite of what it promised. The very inequality the planners meant to abolish reasserted itself, out at the edges, in the unplanned periphery, in the gap between the tidy drawing and the messy truth of who ended up living where. The plan for equality helped produce a familiar inequality. That is the critique. That is the shadow inside the wonder. And there is a subtler cost, too, that Halston and others pointed to, and that I want to mention because it is so very human. Even for the people who did live in the plan center, the perfect modernist city could be a strange and lonely place to actually inhabit. It was designed in that motor rage optimism, for the car vast open spaces, great distances, sweeping roads, buildings set far apart in monumental grandeur. But a human life is not lived at the scale of a monument. Some people found they missed the very thing the planners had swept away. The crowded, tangled, accidental street corner, the little bar you stumble past, the messy public life of an old city that grew by accident. You cannot, it turns out, draw spontaneity. You cannot put a street corner's worth of human chance into a superblock on a plan. The city was a masterpiece to look at, and a puzzle to live in. A boy in one of my classes, years and years ago, a sharp, argumentative boy named Raphael, the kind who was always looking for the loose thread to pull, listened to all of this, to the whole glorious and sorry tale, and he put up his hand, and he asked me the question that goes to the very bottom of it. "Professor," he said, "if they had a completely empty piece of land and the best planners, and they could do literally anything they wanted from scratch, how did they still end up with the poor pushed out to the edge? How is that even possible? They had nothing to copy." And I remember I put down my chalk, because Raphael had, without knowing it, asked the deepest question in the whole of history. And I told him, "Raphael, that is exactly the point, and I want you to remember it your whole life. They did have something to copy. They carried it with them. You can leave the old city 1,000 kilometers behind you. You can start on ground so empty there is not a single wall to knock down. But you cannot leave behind who has money and who does not, who has power and who does not, and whose comfort a society quietly decides to build around and whose it does not. That came inland on the same trucks as the cement. A plan can decide where the roads go. It cannot decide, all by itself, who gets to live at the center of a nation's life and who gets pushed to its edge. That is not settled by an architect. That is settled by everything a country already is. And Raphael, being Raphael, frowned and said, "So it was all for nothing." And I said, "No, no, it was for a very great deal. It just was not for what they thought." So let me turn now, away from the red dust of the plateau and toward you, wherever you are sitting as you listen to me, because this is the thing I most want you to carry out of this room. We love, all of us, the idea of the clean slate, the fresh start, the blank page. It is one of the most beautiful and most dangerous ideas the human mind has ever produced, the belief that if we could only wipe the board clean and start over, from scratch with a good enough plan, we could finally build the fair, rational, perfect thing, free of all the old mess and injustice. A new city, a new company, a new system, a new life. And Brasilia is the purest test of that belief that history has ever run for us. Because they really did get the clean slate. Not a metaphor, 1,000 kilometers of genuinely empty ground. They really did get the best minds and a plan built on equality. They controlled everything. And still, the old inequality walked in the door because it had never been in the ground in the first place. It had been in them, in the society that did the building. The problem was never the old streets of the coast. The problem came inland with the builders, invisible in their luggage, and quietly rebuilt itself at the edge of the shining new town. So here is what I want to leave in your hands, and it is not really about Brazil at all. A nation, it turns out, can do the almost unimaginable. It can conjure a whole capital city out of red dust in 41 months. It can raise cathedrals of curved concrete on ground where a hawk was the tallest thing for 1,000 years. That much, human will and human hands can absolutely do. But there is one thing that no plan, no speed, no clean slate, no genius with a pencil can decree from above. Who ends up at the center and who ends up at the edge. That is not built with concrete. That is carried in, unspoken, by everyone who does the building. And so the future we build, however new, however fast, however boldly we flee the past to build it, the future we build tends, quietly, to inherit the very past we thought we were leaving behind. Brasilia did not fail to be a wonder. It succeeded completely. It just could not outrun the country that made it. Nothing we build ever quite can. Now I would genuinely love to hear from you on this one, and I have two questions, and I mean them both. First, the simple one. Before today, did you know this? Did you know that Brazil built its capital from nothing? In the middle of an empty savanna. In a little over 3 years, the airplane-shaped city, the curved cathedral, the whole impossible thing. Or is Brasilia a name you had heard but never really understood until now? I am always curious how far this story has managed to fly. And second, the one I truly care about, and it is not about Brazil. Think about the clean slates in your own life and in your own country's history. When have you seen someone try to fix a deep old problem by starting completely over with a perfect new plan, and watch the very same old problem quietly reappear inside the shiny new thing? A new town, a new company, a new government, a new beginning that somehow grew the same old edges. Tell me in the comments. I want to see how many of you have watched the past follow the builders inland. And if this was worth your time, if you did not know that a country once willed a capital city out of the dust in 41 months, and then discovered it could not, for all its concrete and all its genius, decide who got to live at the center of it, then do an old teacher one small kindness and subscribe. Because the history of my part of the world is full of stories exactly like this one. Enormous, astonishing, quietly heartbreaking, and left out of everyone else's schoolbooks. And I mean to keep bringing them up into the light, one warm hour at a time, for as long as you will sit with me. My name is Joaquim. Thank you for staying to the end. And the next time someone promises you a perfect fresh start, built fast and clean on empty ground, do me a favor and think of a city of white curves shining in the cerrado and of the builders who raised it, watching it rise from the edge.